Good evening, everyone. My name is Raheem Thompson. I am the manager of public programs. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, and the entire museum, I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight for tonight's program. As an institution grounded in the history and lessons of the Holocaust that works to share universal lessons of humanity and generate awareness and action against injustices worldwide, it is an honor to host this evening's program examining reparations. For more than 12 years, the museum has used its public programming, trainings, and special exhibitions to engage audience through the conversations and stories that connect us as humans. And as an institution, we strive to elicit conversations that help us learn, teach, and inspire. These conversations encourages us to exhibit a heightened level of assertiveness and decorum to look inward and grapple with difficult narratives of the past and present. Our goal with this program is to create a form of dialogue, a safe space to share truth, to speak about legacy, history, and its profound impact on how we see each other and the challenges of inequity and injustice we face today. Joining me tonight are our esteemed panelists, Stefan Cristian Ionescu, a visiting associate professor in Holocaust Studies at Northwestern University, Kamm Howard, a Chicago businessman and widely regarded reparations activist, Kiana Mariah Ross, assistant professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University and recipient of a Spencer Foundation grant to study new reparations and policies. Moderating the panel is Kelley Szany, our Vice President of Education and Exhibitions. Before I pass things off to Kelley, I would like to thank all of our community partners that supported us in putting this program together. And I would like to thank everyone again in attendance. I hope you all enjoyed the program, and please save your questions for the end of the program, but you can enter them in the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. Thank you. And I'd like to pass it off to Kelley.
Thanks, Raheem. I want to again thank everyone for coming this evening. I'm so excited to have this conversation with Kiana and Kamm and Stefan. And just through this process with Raheem and developing this program, have learned so much already from our panelists and some of the prep work. I didn't want to get off the calls with them, so I know we have a lot to talk about. I hope we can get to everybody's questions this evening. But I think, overall, for this evening, I want us to address some of the misconceptions about reparations, some of the challenges, and most importantly, where do we go? Where do we go from here? But I think that when we look at this evening and the program, I think we can look at the great Maya Angelou of blessed memory, who has said it best, that you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And I think that that's a good place to start. And Stefan, I want to start with you and just talking. I know you are doing larger research work on just what is reparations, not only connected to the Holocaust, but Japanese American and Aboriginal people. So can you just talk in general about the history and concept? It's such a large concept of reparations.
Thank you so much, Kelley. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me. I'm extremely honored to be able to participate here in this panel and to discuss such an important issue for not only for the United States society, but for, I think, it's a global issue that is under debate in many countries. So, yes, absolutely. It's a growing interest, I would say, in the topic of reparations, broader topic of restitution, and often Holocaust restitution and reparation is seen as a model for other cases of massive historical injustices and for the survivors and descendants of those survivors, of those who've been victimized, to provide some sort of models for obtaining, hopefully, some forms of restitution and reparation. So I would say that, in broad sense, restitution in broad sense includes different forms of trying to come to terms with the past and provide some measures of justice to this massive violation of human rights. And I want to emphasize that this is an imperfect form of justice. Some forms of justice, right? You cannot repair some terrible things that have been done to human beings, such as mass murder, torture, rape, enslavement. There is no monetary price for that, no financial price for that. So part of this broader, say, term of restitution, scholars, especially Holocaust studies, emphasize like different measures. One of them would be restitution in a narrow sense. That would be the return of property confiscated from individuals and communities, such as land, housing, businesses, hoary relics, artifacts. Another form would be apologies or satisfaction. That means public recognition of wrongdoing, assuming responsibility for it, apologizing, pledging non-repetition. Another measure would be reparations in a narrow sense, also known as compensations. That means various forms of material compensation for what cannot be returned physically. This could be lump sum payments, pensions, awarding the rights to use specific assets, or the revenues produced by those assets. And of course, there are other measures that perhaps not engage too much in it, but absolutely related to education, to broader policies, memorialization, remembrance of the victims, that have to do with a broader sense of kind of creating the sort of common memory, common identity, negotiating this form of identity. Now, strictly about reparations for the Holocaust. I mean, this is a complicated, issue, and I would say that there are several misconceptions about that. One of them is that Holocaust restitution and reparation was very successful. I would argue that was not very successful, actually, as people think about that. So many survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants, their heirs, actually, they do not receive any restitution, reparation for the sufferings they endured during the Holocaust. To kind of summarize what happened with this restitution and reparations, I would distinguish between two main stages in terms of chronology, in terms of time frame. So the first stage during the first post-war years, post-1945 years, after the defeat of Nazi Germany. So some property confiscated by the Nazis and the collaborators was returned to the survivors or the descendants as a result of some of the Allied pressures and legislation, some of the survivor litigation, which was especially successful against individual profiteers and not so much against the state, when the state actually collected this property. Also, there were some reparations as a result of direct negotiations between the perpetrator's legal heir, which was West Germany, because East Germany refused anything. They claimed that they were the heirs of German working class, which also been victim of Nazism, and they did not pursue anything in terms of reparations. So in 1952, there is a very important agreement signed by West Germany with Chancellor Konrad Adenauer at that time, and the newly established State of Israel, and the Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, which was an umbrella organization of different Jewish organizations who had claims representing survivors. So this was like the first such agreement, and stipulated that West Germany will pay more than $1 billion at that time to the State of Israel and to the survivors organizations. And this initial agreement was later on in the next decades supplemented by other agreements. It's important to note here that this was paid not with the title for paying for the lives of people who were murdered in the Holocaust, right? Because again, there is no price for life, you cannot negotiate the blood money. This was paid with the title, legal title, as to help survivors and their descendants rebuild their lives. Because most of them emigrated to Israel, they had to rebuild their lives. Some of them needed special medical attention, healthcare, or education, skill training, professional skill training. So this was kind of the first stage. But at the same time, in Central Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews and other victims of Nazi regime lived before and during the Holocaust, they adopted a different form. There was also some partial restitution of some property, but in some reparations as a form of social welfare, but everything there kind of was stopped by 1948, 1950, because the new dictatorships, these new communist regimes came to power, and they ended this issue, and they implemented their own actually nationalization policies, basically confiscating property, private property from many citizens, including from Jewish survivors. Communist regimes did not
Typically,
appreciated this
yes.
idea, right?
Yeah, yeah, and Stefan, I want to talk a little bit about there was kind of, as you mentioned, that first wave, and then a kind of second round of reparations, and the third round of reparations in particular, which I want to talk about, and just how it changed over generations. But Kamm, there is, I think, a concept that this idea of reparations, particularly for Black Americans, is some sort of new 21st century phenomenon. When in fact, this idea of reparations is something that has existed since enslaved peoples, and really, in some ways, correct me if I'm wrong, but just after this failed attempt to compensate enslaved peoples after Reconstruction. Can you talk a little bit about that and the history of reparations, particularly in the Black community and beyond? Oh, you're muted.
I too, like Stefan, want to thank everyone, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and the organizers for inviting me here. It's a very important panel discussion. Great question. The history of reparations for Blacks in this country is as old as enslavement. There's been recorded cases during enslavement where enslaved Africans or African descendants petitioned for their freedom, petitioned for pensions. Belinda Royale was one who actually won a pension from the trust of her enslaver, who passed and willed her to a son. And she was able to actually win in a Massachusetts court. But certainly after enslavement, even during enslavement, during the Civil War, there was all type of talks and negotiations going on with Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass, with Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet, first to allow Africans to join the war, to fight for their freedom, and then also to talk about how the free men and women would be given a support after the over 246 years of enslavement in this country. Lincoln sent his general to Savannah, Georgia, which was a captured area during the war, before the war ended. As many people may know, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863. It was supposed to go into effect in 1865 on January the 1st. If the Confederate Army did not surrender, they did not surrender. And as a result of the promise made in the Emancipation Proclamation, General Abraham Lincoln sent his Secretary of War Stanton and his General Sherman to Savannah, Georgia, met with 20 Black clergymen, asked them a series of questions about what they thought freedom was and what they needed to be free, how did they want that freedom to look, et cetera. And as a result of that conversation with the clergy, General Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15, which allotted, I think, over 400,000 acres of land that would be utilized for newly freed Africans who would go and they would each get 40 acres and the use of a government mule per family to establish a semi-autonomous territory that no one white except for Union soldiers could enter. It would be an all-Black territory that spanned from South Carolina to Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and the Sea Islands, from the ocean back 15 miles inland. This land would be a land for the freed Africans, because they said they needed land to be free. They could till the land, they could to build community from the land, they could sell surplus produce from the land, they can build homes, they could exploit the resources of the land. They had seaports that they could engage in trade. So it was to be a opportunity for this country to make good on what some of the promises were for Africans to participate in saving the Union and to make amends for the detrimental harms that had been done. But we know that during the Tilden Hayes presidential election, there was a compromise where Tilden had won, I believe, the Electoral College, and Hayes had won the popular vote. And they compromised that if they gave the presidency to Hayes, that he would pull the Union Army out of the South. And when that happened, the Klan rose and began to institute a new system of enslavement and deprivation and atrocities on African descendants at that time. Right after that period, Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson rose and created a membership-based grassroots organization to solicit pensions for elder Africans African descendants who had spent their productive lives in enslavement. And they were not able to take care of themselves. They were not able to provide for their care because they were too old to work. And so they petitioned the government to pay reparations in the form of pensions to the African descendants who were no longer productive. Sister Callie House was in prison as a result of her work. It was stated that she knew that the government was not going to pay reparations, so she was defrauding her membership base. And she was charged for mail fraud because she was sending things through the mail, and was convicted for and sentenced to a year in prison. Spent a year in prison. After that period, we know that in the 1950s, there was a recharge genocide campaign put on by William Patterson and Paul Robeson that went to the United Nations, charging this country with genocide, and there was a reparative package and program attached to that petition. Queen Mother Moore, who also looked at the international arena, also filed a petition that garnered over 1 million signatures that she presented to President Kennedy in 1963, also petitioning this government to engage in reparations for African descendants, Blacks in this country. After Queen Mother Moore, we know that there were several other Black Power, Black nationalist organizations that put in their platforms reparations. The Nation of Islam had a platform for reparations in the 1950s and 60s, and it's still in their platform today in their newspaper, The Final Call, What the Muslim Wants. I think plank number 6 speaks of the land return to African descendants. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense had in its platform reparations. Republic of New Africa, which was a country an organization that had declared independence from the American government, saying that people of African descent were new Africans and that they deserved 5 states in this country. And then, of course, in the 1980s, N'COBRA grew as a mass-based organization with the sole purpose of gaining reparations. With N'COBRA, we were able to influence John Conyers to create the first and only federal legislation since Reconstruction that addresses reparations. That's HR 40. And the 40 was named after the 40 acres and a mule. And so now we have many other organizations that are pushing reparations in this country. And we're at this state now where this country is fully engaged in this conversation, and it hasn't been a conversation of this magnitude since the Reconstruction.
And Kamm, you mentioned HR 40, which I want to talk a little bit about later. But kihana, so Kamm talks about from the 1860, and he's going into the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And one of the kind of continued debates about this is when we look at the Holocaust, as Stefan mentioned, it was a crime that took place in relatively recent history, and that the argument against reparations is, well, too much time has passed. But there also is the other side that slavery didn't end in 1865, and that the legacy and impact of that permeates even in today. So can you talk about that argument and kind of this larger idea and building upon what Kamm said in that work of reparations?
Yeah, so first I just want to thank the Illinois Holocaust Museum for having me. And I also just am honored to be on a panel with Stefan and Kamm. And thank you, Kelley, for moderating. So happy to be here. Yes, definitely. So one of the things that I think is really important that Kamm mentioned is that a lot of people think that reparations is something new, right? Or that it started with John Conyers, or that it started with somehow it rose out of the BLM movement, or that it's something that happened after, George Floyd is murdered. And no, like Kamm said, this is something that Black folks began agitating for actually during enslavement. And this country continually said, no, we will not give you reparations for these atrocities that have been committed against you and your families. And so I think that it's a little bit unfair to, as a country, continually refuse reparations over centuries and then say, well, actually, it's been too long, so now we can't do anything about it, right? It's not our fault that folks said no for so long, or that there was never an attempt made to create repair or redress. That is the fault of the federal government, right? Because slavery was sanctioned by the Constitution. And so the federal government has a responsibility to provide redress for slavery. And if the federal government decided that they weren't going to do that until now or until 20 years from now, that's kind of on them. So that, I think that's one of the arguments. And another thing that I think is really important is that, people like to say, that happened so long ago, and that was then, and this is now. And I think one of the problems is that the way that we learn about slavery in schools in particular is like, it was this bad thing, people were beaten, then Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, Black people sung songs, there was Juneteenth, and life was better, right? And that's not what happened at all. And in fact, even if we, just say like, yeah, there was emancipation technically, but there was also 100 years of like state-sanctioned racialized terror after that, right? There's Jim Crow. There's, a lot of people are learning now about the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? Like they're all, and that's just one example. These things are happening on a day-to-day basis, and continuing into the present, right? When we're thinking about, police terror against the Black community. And that's just one aspect. We can look at education, we can look at healthcare, we can look at housing, we can look at the prison industrial complex. Like the afterlife of slavery is very much a real thing. And so I think that's also something to consider. And the final thing I'll just say is that people don't talk about the people that did get reparations for slavery, right? The white folks who got reparations for the property that they lost. They don't talk about things like the Homestead Act, right? Which gave land to like a tenth, I think, of the land that was available in the entire nation was given away to white folks through the Homestead Act, right? White folks from here and also from other places. And 20% of the population today descends from those homesteaders. So if you think about that in the context of generational wealth and how that wealth is built versus folks who don't have those opportunities, that's very much in the present.
That's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I forgot about the Homestead Act. You're correct. You're right. It's so fascinating. And Stefan, so the country of Germany, which I don't think a lot of people understand, is that it really took several decades to get to where it did, to agree to reparations. They really felt, as you know, in the immediate aftermath of the war, and for many years, that they weren't criminals, that an evil hadn't been committed, but they were actually war's victims, right? Their cities had been destroyed, their women were raped by Soviet soldiers, they were trying to rebuild their country, and perhaps the sense that if we throw money at it, we'll be good. But what started to change, and who really, was it the government? Was it a younger generation? Who really started to push for change in Germany to push for reparations for what happened during the Holocaust?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. If I just follow up briefly on
Please.
What Dr. Ross was saying earlier, I think very interesting point, because this often is an argument against reparations to African Americans, invoking this statute of limitation, right? That so much time had passed, right? But usually, I mean, in international law, if you think about, there is no statute of limitation for crimes against humanity, for genocide, which slavery and other actions such as actually Jim Crow laws and lynching would fit very well according to some schools, even in the concept of genocide, crimes against humanity. So for that, there is no prescription. There'll be no, so this could be invoked as one argument supporting reparations. Returning to your question, Kelley, yes, absolutely. I would say that in Germany, as I mentioned, this important agreement between West Germany and State of Israel and the Claims Conference, this umbrella organization for Jewish organization survivors in 1952, this is rather very recent, very soon after the war. War ended up in 1945. But we have to say that this agreement, which was, of course, very insufficient, limited, right? Most of the survivors didn't really benefit from this agreement. This was adopted not because most of the Germans at that time supported it. Actually, most of the Germans, as you said earlier, they were against paying reparations to Jewish survivors or other survivors, I mean, of Nazi.
Yeah, I have a stat that in 1953, 11% of Germans agreed.
Oh,
and
yes,
even
absolutely.
today, it's only 29%.
Exactly, no. And this, why it's important there, that this was a decision of the highest level of political decision makers in Germany. I mentioned specifically the Chancellor Konrad Adenauer from the Christian Democratic Party, was an opponent of Nazism. He basically decided, together with other German decision makers, that this would be important measure for Germany, even though at that time West Germany was not yet as prosperous and wealthy as it will grow in the next decades. Still, I mean, they were recovering from war, but reconstruction after the war required a lot of money and resources. But this was a political decision, again, by a very small elite at the highest level of the German politics, because he thought it's good for Germany, in a sense. Maybe also some moral reason, but the main, scholars argue that the main justification was that he thought it would be good for Germany image abroad, kind of rehabilitating Germany, all these crimes, also will help relations, better relations with the United States. He may suspected that maybe United States cares a lot about Jewish survivors. So in a way, it was kind of like politically motivated measure that was not very popular in Germany at that time. And this continued over the next decades with other agreements. I would say that support in Germany for confronting this difficult past of the country grew later on, especially, I mean, in 1960s with the younger generations who started to ask questions about the parents and the grandparents. What did you do, you know, grandfather in the war, right? With this generation, with youngsters who already got used to living with better standard of living and started to be more concerned with human rights and protests, so protest movements. So this was growing in Germany during the Cold War, but still, I mean, this goes also parallel with another process. It's called denazification process that was imposed basically by the Allies. So Germany at the end of the war was occupied by the Allied forces. It's 4 countries in United States, France, UK, Soviet Union. Then they divided Germany in this kind of their own spheres of West Germany, East Germany. And they started this process of denazification, basically trying to ban people who've been involved with Nazis from a certain years, from public office or some professional interdictions. Also to try to kind of create this more democratic culture in Germany through education, through schools, to public event commemorations, to kind of, in a way, to fight with this kind of strong anti-Semitism that still existed in Germany, with this strong racism, with this legacy of Nazis, which didn't go away so quickly. I mean, as was mentioned earlier, in the case of this legacy of slavery, of racism, it doesn't go away so quickly. It needs generations and generations. So, I mean, this continued with decades after the war, and I would say only in 1990s with the reunification, the 2 Germanys came together in a new, stronger, democratic Germany. Germany continued these programs of reparations, addressing more groups of survivors who did not receive that. So in 1990s were other important programs of reparations, addressing specific groups of individuals that have been persecuted, so-called slave labor litigation for the millions and millions of people who've been enslaved by Nazi Germany in slave labor or in forced labor programs. They're not only Jews. I mean, actually, most of them are non-Jewish people from, you know, kidnapped basically, or persuaded or tricked into these programs of forced labor, slave labor. So that was important agreement adopted in 1999, where German companies who came together and contributed to this fund, so to pay about $5 billion US dollars to former slave laborers and forced laborers, with kind of some calculated according to how long you've been working in this slave or forced labor projects, because most of the German companies, they profited from these Nazi policies and this slave and forced labor, and they continue, like companies that are huge today. I mean, like including, you know, Bayer, you know, the chemicals, or, you know, from, I don't know, so many companies that have been involved, construction companies and others. And then other programs of reparations were negotiated in 1990s and 2000. For example, the insurance companies. So German and other European insurance companies also benefited a lot from the Holocaust. Companies like Allianz or Generali. So facing this pressure from public opinion on one hand, litigations from survivors and the descendants, and third, this political advocacy and political pressures from different governments and parties, they kind of agree with the settlement. Just to add here that, so most of these reparation programs that survivors benefited or the descendant benefited, they did not came up only as a result of litigation in courts, as a result of a court decision. So litigation was one avenue of putting pressure on different beneficiaries, different governments, different institutions to agree and negotiate and settle to pay this. Even actually, most of the Jewish survivors or other survivors who went to court and sued, they lost their cases in court. So I would say that, I mean, for the future, this should be like only one of the avenues of trying to obtain some reparations for survivors. In addition to mobilizing political support at the highest decision-making level, like in the United States, I'm thinking about, you know, advocacy in Washington, D.C., but also the local political level, like in local councils, in local state legislators. And third, mobilizing public opinion, especially the media, because this was crucial for the success of these reparation programs for Holocaust survivors. It was really crucial. The pressure in media, all these revelations in media, these articles, stories on TV about profiteers, about victims who are struggling decades after the event, you know, didn't receive anything. They're struggling with a lot of health issues. As was mentioned earlier, this psychological implications, you know, survivors, even second or third generations are struggling with this trauma and legacies of this massive violation of human rights. So it's kind of like broader policies trying to address this legacies of this massive violation of human rights.
Yeah, and Kamm, one of the things that that Stefan just mentioned in this kind of second wave of Holocaust reparations in 1952, and we were talking how the majority of people weren't really supportive of it, and even there were individuals in Israel that weren't supportive of it, and it was really also centered around this larger question, which kihana brought up, is just the idea of redress and how do you calculate payment. And when we look at reparations today, particularly for Black Americans, that's part of the bigger discussion, right? Is the money, but how much and when and how far do we go back? So can you talk a little bit about that conversation that's happening, not only maybe an update or share of where the support lands either locally or nationally from Americans, particularly white Americans with regards, and Black Americans in regards to reparations, and just this larger concept of how do you calculate, how do you ultimately calculate the injustice that happened? Oh, you're muted again, Kamm.
I'll definitely address that. But before I do, I want to go back to something that both Stefan and kihana stated. When we talk about it happened a long time ago, in COBRA, we just released in October a report we call the Harm Report. We commissioned the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is related to Johns Hopkins University Medical Center, to do a report to look at the science, the existing science around transgeneration epigenetic inheritance and systemic racism and how it is passed down generationally. And Stefan talked about historical trauma. The basic historical trauma model begins with, you know, there was a culture intact, and something traumatic happened to the people in the culture. And then later, after that ended, you're able to measure from that point, generations down, people who are affected by that initial historical trauma. But in our instance, there's never been a time in this country where there's not been historical trauma. We have 246 years of historical trauma of enslavement, 100 years, as Stefan stated, of historical trauma through apartheid in this country, legalized apartheid in this country, and the continued historical trauma of mass incarceration, police terror, et cetera, going back, the Black Panther Party fighting for self-defense from police terror, and we're still fighting from self-defense for police terror today. So there's never been a period in this country where there's not been an attack on the psyche of African people. And we know that through this modern science, looking at Jewish Holocaust survivors and third generation descendants, that it not only affects the psyche, it also affects their physicality with the modifications to the epigenome, which leads to premature illness, premature aging, cancer, and a host of other diseases. And so when you talk about it happened a long time ago, no, it's happening now. It's happening now, and it's going to continue to happen in the future in our progeny until we address this. So just want to state that. When it comes to compensation, compensation has always been a very sticky point in this country when it comes to reparations. If you ask white Americans, do they believe in reparations? They associate reparations to compensation to a check, and the majority of them, over 70, 80% say, no, we don't favor reparations. But when you say, do you favor an educational policy? Then you see the numbers shift. You'll find that upwards to 30, 40% of white Americans favor reparations in the form of education. So in COBRA, early on, we knew that that was not something that we would push for in the public. We understood that compensation is a legitimate form of reparations. And so we would struggle for that in a situation where we were negotiating settlement, but publicly we would push what we call the 5 injury areas for repair: education, economic development, which is job training, more employment opportunities, wealth building opportunities, business opportunities, etc., things of that nature. Health was an injury area. Our peoplehood, our culture, the destruction of our cultural identity and our cultural norms and mores that we brought to this country and that were beat out of us in a lot of instances, and also the criminal justice system. So we were focused publicly on these 5 injury areas, but privately we would deal with this issue of compensation because, as Stefan said, under international law, compensation is a recognized form of reparations, along with cessation and guarantees of non-repetition, along with restitution, along with compensation, along with satisfaction and rehabilitation. And so we would not push for compensation, but publicly we knew that we would get the most challenge from white America. And so today we have a lot of talk and conversation about compensation, and rightfully so. We should have that conversation. In some cases it helps, in some cases it doesn't. We just have to have a very a conversation that is helpful when we deal with compensation. One way to do that is to demonstrate how the Citigroup reported that reparations in the form of compensation would bring billions of dollars into the American economy. If paid to people of African descent, it would benefit actually trillions of dollars into the economy, not billions. I think it was $5 trillion over 15 years or so if they had paid reparations. So we can look at compensation in that argument that it benefits all of America when paid to people of African descent. So when we talk about what is the cost of compensation, there's many models that have been used, and some just look at the theft of African labor during enslavement, those 246 years, just in the theft of labor paid, that was calculated according to the skill set that they had at that particular time, multiplied by the 4 million Africans who were enslaved and freed in 1865, account for inflation, you get up to like $14 trillion. That doesn't look at the damage to mind, body, and spirit. the murders, et cetera, et cetera. That's just theft of labor. It doesn't take into account the theft of labor during the convict leasing system, during the sharecropping system and other forms of theft and plunder that existed after enslavement. So, you know, the number is astronomical. This country can pay it. It can pay it, you know, over time. They can pay it, as we saw how trillions of dollars have been released into the economy during COVID. This country could do the same thing over a period of time if they desired. And with all, again, with the understanding and the proof, the data that shows it benefits the country, raises the GDP about 3 or 4 tenths of a point each year, creates hundreds of thousands of jobs each year, puts billions of dollars into the economy. So, you know, that's, you know, compensation, we can have the conversation, but we want to have it in a way that is one that we can get, it's not hurting the movement, and that it will get us closer to a unified voice on that particular issue.
Yeah, and Kihana, you, when you and Raheem and I met earlier, you talked a bit about that, about how that some of it, yes, is about the compensation or the cash in hand, but then also there needs to be a conversation about a systems change. And, you know, Kamm mentioned the 5 injury areas, but can you talk about beyond compensation, this larger idea of what then needs to, it's not an either or, it shouldn't be an either or concept. What are the system changes that need to happen?
Yeah, I can. I think one of the things I want to say just briefly to touch on what Kamm was just saying is that, and the question that you asked is oftentimes there's this, you know, thing that happens where people are like, it's so complicated to figure it out. Like there's too many people, it's too long ago, it's too much money, we just can't. I'm like, we put folks on the moon. Like we send people to a different planet, right? Like we live in a world that we only used to see on the Jetsons, right? That is happening. We send a message to someone in a totally different country in a split second. Like we can figure this out, you know? And so I just want to say that I think we need to continue to push back against this narrative that it's just too complicated for us to figure out. You know, we can figure it out, and we should figure it out. So I just wanted to say that. And in terms of, you know, thinking about reparations in a more expansive way, so I'm just going to back up 1 second too, and say that a part of the thing that happens is that we end up, and I understand why we do it, because, you know, part of what Kamm is saying, for example, is that we don't want to damage the movement, and we need to be having conversations that resonate with folks so that we can get public support. And at the same time, I just want to acknowledge that that's wrong, right? That we shouldn't have to, as Black folks who are the descendants of folks who were murdered, raped, brutalized, tortured, and the only race of people who's left with absolutely zero capital, nothing, right? Like you can't even imagine what that's like. And then to be enduring the broader anti-Blackness of a country in addition to having nothing. But so I just want to say that for us to then be in a position where we have to convince people why it is that there should be redress for that is a problem. So I just want to acknowledge that and put that in the air, because I think it's important. I get why we have to do it, because public support is necessary, but it's also wrong. And I think we should just say that. But in terms of thinking about reparations more expansively, I think it's just what makes sense, because the ways that Black folks were harmed and continue to be harmed are visible in all of these different areas, right? If we look at education, for example, even up to the 1930s, right, in places in the South, there was no high school for Black folks, right? There wasn't a high school available. And so if you think about something like that, what does that mean for the education that was stolen from those folks? What does it mean for then those folks to try to get their kids the kind of education that they don't even understand because they didn't have access to it? And so I think that it's important to think about all of the ways, my focus is education, that we can think about providing redress for the myriad ways that Black folks have experienced and continue to experience racialized harm.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I totally agree with Kiana with the statement. We should not have to hold back in our and be more forceful in, declaring what is actually deserved and owed. So yeah, totally agree with that. We're in a different place today than we were, 15, 20 years ago when NCOBRA determined that we would, put that on a internal discussion, and publicly we will move forward with these other areas because, we were fighting to get white allyship. This country, even in Congress, we have 53 CBC members now, probably 55, more than any other time. We still cannot pass any legislation with 55 votes. You need 218. And so you have to politically do what is necessary in order to get the type of support to pass legislation. And, we have to play the game. But you're absolutely right, Kiana. Totally agree with you.
And I just want to say too, I didn't say this because I got caught up in another thing, but I think, another piece of it just is that, it's just more palatable. It's like Kamm was talking about how you see the numbers increase when you start to talk about systems change. When you start to talk about education, people are like, yeah, I can get behind education, right? That's a different kind of thing. And so I think, I have this concept that I use that's called like the meantime in between time, right? There's this bigger thing that we can fight for. And there's also like, what are the things that we can do right now to mitigate Black suffering, right? What are the things in the educational context that we can do right now to make the lives of Black students better? And I think it's okay to be working at both of those levels, to say we can think about reparations in this way, and we can also support this broader demand for direct compensation.
So you're not saying it's and Stefan, I'll get to you, but so you're not saying, again, like it's not an either or thing, and it's not per se helping or hurting the movement in any way by going broader. Is it hurting the movement at all? Helping it?
I think it only hurts the movement if we say that reparations is only compensation.
Okay.
And, try to drown out any voice that says it's more than compensation. It's compensation, and we're not saying that it's not compensation, but it's compensation and a whole lot more.
More, yeah. Interesting. And Stefan, can you talk? We've and Kamm mentioned a little bit, in particular, the inability at this point for our government to even get off the House floor, the House Resolution 40. But when we look at even Germany today and Angela Merkel, many might say that her inability to form a coalition was her continued insistence on more reparation payment. We know that Germany has paid billions of dollars up to this point. Can you talk just about even Germany today, Europe today? We saw the news over the past year, even the country of Poland, when it comes to property, right, to go back to Jews, just the larger political pressures that are happening in more recent years in Germany and beyond when it comes to issues of reparations.
Absolutely. Just to make another short follow-up on earlier conversation. Absolutely. There are measures that could be adopted at local level that could profit a certain group of people. I'm just thinking about in relation to this education. Like a few years ago, students from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., they adopted this resolution to increase the tuition with a small amount of the fees they're paying, exactly to contribute to this form of reparations for students who are descendants of those slaves owned by the Georgetown University, by the Jesuit, who were sold to allow their descendants to go to study at Georgetown, as this very prestigious university, to acquire a good education. So this is kind of like small, limited measure adopted in a specific part of the country that could be, emulated in other parts of the country, I guess, in different ways. But to return to your question, Kelley, about Europe and political pressure, in Germany, absolutely, still a thorny issue. This issue of reparations in Europe, of restitution of Jewish property. I mean, there is no consensus. I mean, even in Germany or in other countries, like I'm from Eastern Europe, I'm from Romania. Romania adopted several laws, measures paying some form of reparations very late in 1990s, in 2000. Again, kind of as a form of, not because not because most of the citizens agree with that or were interested in that. Actually, most of the citizens thought that only Germany is responsible for the Holocaust, while Romania was the second largest Holocaust perpetrator. But mostly also kind of because of foreign pressure. I mean, Romanian government, Romanian politicians, they thought it's a useful measure, maybe to have good relations with the United States, maybe with Israel, with other countries, but still it's a contentious issue. And we have to say, most of the property confiscated from Jews and as well as from other groups was not returned. Most of the Jewish survivors did not receive pensions because they died before 1990s, before 2000. But in Germany itself, well, just make a point here. Angela Merkel is no longer the chancellor of Germany. She retired finally, I think last year. There's a new chancellor, Olaf Scholz. But absolutely, she encounters these problems as a highly, progressive, I think, politician, also a female politician. This also kind of matters, right? That was several, times prime minister that has a strong impact on German politics. Some scholars say that she's probably one of the most important, chancellor in German politics since 1945. Yes, she encountered these problems, but I mean, German society still, managed to negotiate, overcome, and I think until now, Germany pay up to, I think, close to $100 billion in different programs of reparations to different groups of survivors. Is it enough? No, it's not. Does it cover all the harm done and destruction of property of lives perpetrated by Germany? No, it does not. But still, there is some measure of justice and shows some form of willingness by the democratic Germany, by this democratic political consensus to address some of these arguments. Yes, there are problems in Germany as well. And today, democratic Germany, including this, I think, worrying the rise of right-wing, kind of like neo-Nazis, neo-fascist movements everywhere in Europe. I've seen them, including, in countries like Poland, you mentioned, more like right-wing governments in Poland and Hungary that also engage in kind of anti-Semitism, and also very much in Poland, they were against restitution of Jewish property, which in Poland it's a huge problem because, as you remember, Poland hosted the largest Jewish community in Europe before the Holocaust. Like 3.3 million people were Jewish in Poland before the war. Most of them were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. Very few of them emigrated very quickly from Poland, facing this pressure from local anti-Semites or the communist regime. But yes, it's still a thorny issue. But in general, there have been important measures and a variety of measures. I would mention here another thing that's a bit kind of not directly related to that, but it matters. Many countries in the European Union have adopted laws criminalizing Holocaust denial. So actually, if you deny the Holocaust, including different aspects related to slavery, slave labor, or theft of property, it's a crime. Actually, you might go to jail. The problem is, of course, this law is not very well enforced actually in most of the countries. So in a way, it's kind of like formal on paper law and not so much enforced, but still it's a measure in a way that contributes to that. But still, there is a lot of resistance, a lot of reluctance against restitution. Just to mention one more point, I forgot completely about that, about the minority group that was so much neglected and forgotten as victims of the Holocaust. Is the case of the Roma and the Gypsies, who were very much persecuted by the Nazis. Some scholars argue that after the Jews and people with disabilities, the Roma and the Gypsies were the target of the most radical genocidal policies implemented by Nazi Germany and their allies, including Romania, who deported part of the Roma, the Gypsy community, to Transnistria, to this area of camps and ghettos. About half of the deported Roma died there. That was also an area where, with a lot of camps and ghettos, where Jews were deported and murdered. So often the Roma were forgotten for restitution and reparations for decades. Only in the 1990s, in 2000, some of the Roma survivors, against most of the people passed away by that time, 4 or 5 decades, they received some form of pensions, few reparations, others, but very little, very few. Many of them struggle also with these legal technicalities that prevented actually reparations, because all these authorities and institutions that were charged to implement the restitution disburse these funds. They ask all kind of documents, proofs of evidence of surviving the camps, of deportation, of legal certificates, when we know that the perpetrators in the Holocaust did not really provide accurate documents of people they murdered. Often they destroyed the IDs and the documents of people they were murdering. They did not issue death certificate that this family was murdered in a gas chamber, was shot in mass and buried in mass grave. So some Roma received some little insufficient reparations, but I want to say here another aspect about that. It's kind of forgotten. So in Romania, most of the Roma were slaves actually in Romania. So until mid-19th century. So they're liberated from slavery maybe almost the same time with African Americans in the United States, in Romania in the 1850s. There was until today no reparations for slavery whatsoever. While very few and limited reparations for Holocaust survivors, nothing for those who died in slavery or for their descendants. It's rather very taboo topic. It's not so much discussed. Many Roma were enslaved by local boyars, nobles, by the state, or also by the church, by the monastery. So they don't want even to open the archives. Actually, the church, the majority church, like the Romanian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Church, does not really want to open the archives actually to address this issue of Roma slavery. So the church, right, preaching this important teaching that Christianity, love treat people, they own slaves for hundreds of years. So this is very problematic aspect, I think, with this Holocaust and reparations program.
Yeah, and Stefan, if we have time, I want to come back just to even, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of, just the criteria. I know, in the late 1990s with that, with the third round in 1998, just some of the survivors that used to come to the museum and the ridiculous documentation that they were asked to provide that just would have never been possible, and made the kind of hurdles that one had to jump to in order to obtain reparations almost ridiculous. And then the rejection letters that the survivors would receive, and it was a cycle. But Kamm, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that a lot of people that look at Holocaust reparations and reparations for Black Americans particularly point to this third wave of reparations in 1998, particularly as perhaps the most successful model when looking at what could be learned for reparations for Black Americans today, specifically because, as Stefan mentioned, it was the government, but also the industries that worked together. And that perhaps when we look at reparations for Black Americans, looking at other governments, so do we look at France and Spain and the UK, right, that also were involved in slavery, but do we look at the industries that were involved, the railroad companies, the insurance companies? So can you talk a little bit about that? Are other countries besides the United States having these conversations? And also, is there a movement towards going after corporations or industries that were part of enslaved peoples?
Sure. As Stefan stated early on, at the beginning of this conversation, that this is a global issue. Africans and people of African descent, African countries, African nations, Caribbean countries, African groups, African descendant groups in Europe, in France and Britain and Italy and other countries in Europe, all having this conversation, targeting the governments of Europe, as well as the American government, as a culprit of the atrocities that are committed and the ongoing legacy of those atrocities that people are suffering or going through today. In America, in COBRA, we initially came out with our definition of reparations in 1989. We officially stated that reparations was the process of repairing, healing, and restoring to people who were injured due to their group identity in violation of their fundamental human rights by a government, corporation, institution, or individual family. So in that definition, we list 4 culpable parties, not just governments, not just the federal government, but also local governments and state governments. We've done initiatives around state and local governments prior to this new wave mostly were around slavery disclosure ordinances, mandating that corporations who wanted to do businesses in the state or in the city had to produce records to show whether or not they had benefited from enslavement. That was, some of our local efforts at the time. In 2001, 2002, 2000, as a result, 2000 to 2002, as a result of those local ordinances and state ordinances, we initiated several lawsuits against the corporations. Those lawsuits were consolidated. And in 2005, a judge in federal court in Chicago ruled that we did not have standing to bring a lawsuit. He ruled it on procedural grounds, but not on the merits of the case. He stated it was political. It should be something happening in the political arena and not the legal arena because what Stefan has stated that erroneously that the statute of limitation had ran out. And as Stefan stated, there is no statute of limitation on crimes against humanity. He stated that we were too far removed from the injury. What this new science is saying that we're not too far removed. We actually are the ones who are injured through the transgeneration of genetic inheritance and transgenerational transmission of trauma. We're not removed. We are, and our children will be suffering from the effects of the historical traumas that have been committed. So today, we have new tools to use to go after these other culprits, to go after the corporations, to go after the institutions, to go after the churches, to go after the educational institutions, to go after the medical institutions that participated in the destruction of African humanity and life, to go after the wealthy families who have their resources locked into family foundations, attempting to protect them from lawsuit or from challenge. We have the tools now to go after those other entities and institutions. And so we'll see, and COBRA is going to initiate more of that now. And that was part of producing, why we produced our report, the harm report, to indicate and to demonstrate that, the railroad, Norfolk Southern Railroad is one. We went after them in 2017, I think it was, for 30 years during enslavement and for about 60 years after enslavement, during the apartheid system, doing convict leasing. They robbed African life and labor during that time and built a tremendous amount of wealth. I mean, it's like a $56, $60 billion company today. And there's, in Chicago, there's probably about 35 or 40 of such companies and institutions that we can target. And you'll see more of that coming forward, especially since, people are ready to mobilize around this issue, and not just for local governments, but for local businesses, corporations, and institutions that are operating in their cities who have this history.
Well, in the questions are coming in fast and furious, and I have so much more I want to ask. Kihana, I want to ask you kind of the elephant in the room, the sticky question that I got a lot in advance of this program from folks that I talked to, who would say, what do you say to people who say this is unfair? That my family I know didn't own slaves, or my family were immigrants to the United States. We shouldn't have to pay reparations. What do you say to those individuals?
Well, I think that's one of the misconceptions about reparations, is that people start to feel like I'm going to have to pay $100 per month to Black folks I don't know, who didn't even, who weren't even enslaved. And I think that the way that we need to be looking at it is, this is a country that we all live in. This is a country where, like I said before, slavery was sanctioned by the Constitution. And so this country has to make amends, or again, they'll never be able to make amends, but has to begin the process of redress for for the atrocities that this country inflicted against Black folks. And so everyone who is a citizen of this country, you know, we are all a part of that, right? And it doesn't mean that we have to think about it as, you know, the money that I'm paying out of my pocket towards, but we do have to think about it as being a part of a country that is responsible and that does have to, in whatever way it can, begin that process of redress. I mean, the same way that the country should apologize, right? It's not saying that individual people who, you know, are living in California and, you know, at the beach, like, hey, wait, what do I have to do with slavery? It's not to say that, you know, you need to personally apologize for the period of chattel enslavement, but the country does have to apologize, right? And the last thing I'll say about that is that, again, when we're thinking about wealth and wealth being much more important than income, right? These are things that you can trace to today, right? The wealth gap that we talk about is directly traceable to the period of enslavement. And it's not just about the wealth that Black folks don't have, but it's also about the wealth that white folks do have, right? And that's what I was saying too about the Homestead Act and thinking about like really like 1.5 million white folks got free land, right? Like that's kind of incredible, right? And their descendants are benefiting from that land that they got, right? Their descendants are able to buy homes in a different way and live in a different way because of that generational wealth. And so I think when folks are thinking about it like, well, it's not me, I'm not the one who did this, or you're not the one who were directly enslaved, we have to both think on this bigger level, right, of the country and what the country did. And we have to think about, you know, the afterlife of slavery and the ways that those, you know, sins continue to affect Black folks today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Kihana, there's a lot of questions that are coming in, and Kamm and Stefan, jump in here too. There's a lot of questions that are coming in about Evanston. All right, so Evanston being the first city in the country to have a reparations for Black Americans. And they've done it in a number of ways. And Kamm, I know you were really integral to the movement, but Kihana, I know you can't talk about your research, but you are in real time, right, beginning to research this impact. So can either of you just talk even about Evanston? What's the status? There's a lot of questions that people are asking, particularly about criteria, right? And how does one get chosen or picked, or what is the criteria to receive reparations? And talk about Evanston and maybe why they were able to get to where they were today.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things, and Kamm may know even more about this than me. But one of the things that I think is important to note, first, I think we need to applaud Robin Ruth Simmons and the work that she did to get that resolution passed. And there's a lot of, you know, people have a lot of strong feelings about reparations in Evanston and what's happening. And I think that this is one of those situations where we need to be talking in both and language and not necessarily, you know, either or, right? Like some people are saying this is about housing, this isn't reparations, this is focused on housing, it's not focused on slavery. Or, you know, you talked about who qualified, this is open to folks who are not descending from enslaved Africans. And I think that the way we should be thinking about it is, yes, we still need to be agitating for broader reparations and reparations for slavery. And this is that whole meantime and between time I was talking about. But we also need to support and celebrate the moves that we are making toward providing redress for Black folks in any way that comes. And I think the idea that Black folks who, you know, were discriminated against, who experience racialized housing disparities in a particular area of Evanston are being compensated in some way. Again, we can't ever provide full compensation, but that they're being compensated in some way is something that we should celebrate. So I just want to say that because I think that's a big part of the conversation, and I think it's important to celebrate as we continue to agitate in other ways.
Kamm, do you want to talk a little bit more about Evanston? And someone had a follow-up question to you about just the global conversation. They loved that. and wanted to know if there have been any reparations to descendants of people enslaved by Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, etc. So you get a twofer.
So I just want to share with Kiana how much we should just lift up Alderman Robert Rue Simmons, former Alderman Simmons. You know, there was an event in Evanston where the National African American Reparations Commission brought Danny Glover to Evanston and in a town hall. And as I was about to present Alderman Simmons with a plaque from Cobra, I got a call from one of our ancestors now, Conrad Worrell, who's a long time, Dr. Conrad Worrell is a long time advocate and fighter, scholar activist in this country. He told me to state that Robin was the Rosa Parks of the reparations movement. And it's apropos because Rosa Parks, with her act, she inspired hundreds of thousands of people who were fearful prior to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. And it's changed the entire movement, and it changed America. And Robert Rue Simmons inspired legislators and people all around the country to engage in local actions against their municipalities, to create legislation, California legislation. We were just in Evanston about 2-3 months ago, where Robin's company organization, First Repair, had a forum with over 60 people from about 30 different cities who were engaged in, who came to learn more about how they could advocate and produce a similar type of efforts in their locations. So she's inspired conversations around the world on reparations, and people are talking who may not have talked about it. So, you know, what has happened in Evanston has gone way beyond Evanston. We have to, if you're for reparations, you have to honor that. It may not be exactly what you want, but the benefit of what happened in Evanston is tremendous in this country and globally in the movement. So I just state that. And the second thing about has nations paid reparations? In Brazil, coming out of the World Conference Against Racism, they took the declaration of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action very seriously. And that declaration stated that slavery was a crime against humanity, transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, the crimes against humanity. There was an economic benefit to those crimes. The people who were the victims, today their descendants are economically deprived, and the people who were, and countries who were the perpetrators, they are wealthy, as well as their descendants exist with a tremendous amount of wealth, as we can see in America with the wealth disparity that exists here, and that reparations were due. And in Brazil, they took it seriously. They engaged in many reparations initiatives, free education, economic development for people and communities who had resisted enslavement and existed in a quasi-free societies across Brazil. During the period of enslavement, there was economic development for the indigenous communities. They engaged in return of land. I mean, large parcels of lands the size of 2 or 3 New Yorks were given to some of the descendants who had lived in these autonomous areas that were taken over after the end of enslavement in Brazil. And that's one of the countries that did most. But after, as Stefan and others have stated, these right-wing governments came in and like Johnson rescinded President Lincoln's field order, these right-wing governments have retarded a lot of the gains that happened in the early 2000s and some coming out of the World Conference Against Racism. The European governments at the review conference that was held in 2009, over 17 walked out of the conference, and these 17 that walked out of the conference were the major beneficiaries, perpetrators of the trade, perpetrators of colonialism, perpetrators of apartheid regimes. They walked out, and they are steadfast, holding out against engaging in reparations. But we're having a discussion, and there is a lot of civil society organizations and institutions in Europe, primarily educational institutions who are having these discussions, as well as civil society organizations are having these discussions. And we're going to see, as here in America, we just have to continue to fight, continue to push. But this is a conversation, this is an action that I think is going to result globally in success for people of African descent around the world.
And Stefan, you mentioned you've done a lot of research on the Holocaust reparations movement as a whole against many different peoples, Japanese Americans, Aborigines. Do you see kind of the jumping off point of this panel was or this conversation was lessons to be learned? Is there I think we could spend all day talking about the challenges, but is there a thread that you can kind of, or a couple of threads that you could pull from them that you think is words of encouragement, to kind of, or a success in the movement for us to kind of look at through this lens? You talked a little bit before about just local, national government advocacy, but through that lens, what are you seeing through your research? Are those kind of sparks of success that we've seen through these different movements?
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, I just want to mention that the United States has a relatively successful case of reparations to a group of victims of massive historical injustice, like Japanese Americans, who during Second World War, about 120,000 of Japanese Americans, mostly living on the West Coast, have been interned in, some sort of internment camps, concentration camps throughout the country because they're suspected of being disloyal, even though there's not specific evidence of a specific crime perpetrated by them. Many of them were citizens, actually of the United States, others were not, but they were living here for a long time. The property, I mean, they had to sell in a rush the property they own, or they simply lost it. I mean, entire families were interned there, so not just the say, men who could be pose a security threat, but entire families. I mean, women, children, elderly, people retired, disabilities. Some people were released towards the end of the war. Others in 1946, so took some time after the war. And only in 1988, United States government adopted a specific legislation agreeing to pay reparations to about 80,000 Japanese American survivors, so only to those who were alive at that time, not about 2/3 of those who've been interned, a sum of $1.6 billion US, so about $20,000 per person, as a form of reparations for the sufferings. And also issue a national apology to Japanese Americans. But this did not came because the government decided to do so. It came as a result of decades of advocacy from the organization of Japanese Americans. Rather a small group, but still, I mean, it's an example when, United States was able to do something actually for a group that had been, victimized by an extremely unjust policy. And I mean, to connect with what was said earlier, I mean, yes, it's a broader movement around the world, a global movement for reparations and to address or institution to address one way or another this massive historical injustices, massive breaches of human rights from indigenous population, the Aboriginals in Australia who received some parts of land or the rights to exploit, Maori in New Zealand. It's a very contentious issue still in South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa. As we know, while South Africa in the 1990s managed to have this political transition of power, right, without, avoiding a civil war that everybody was afraid. In terms of the economics, actually the economic power remained in the hands of a small white minority, about maybe 5, 6, 7% of the population. So there's still a lot, like almost 3 decades after this transfer of political power that took place peacefully in South Africa. Remember all those measures from important work of Bishop Desmond Tutu with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But still, the economic power, the control of the land, the economy, the businesses remains in the hands of a small minority that was somehow responsible and beneficiary of this long time of apartheid and exploitation of indigenous African people. So there is a broader movement, some return of land, I mean, some other forms of reparation, but still there's a lot to be done. I mean, to connect with what was said earlier, I mean, with this, the legacy of this European colonial powers, because it has to do a lot with colonialism, like, France, Britain, Portugal, Belgium, Spain. I mean, these countries, for example, they pay, I think Kiana mentioned earlier, they pay a lot of reparation to slave owners because they lost their property from 19th century. I mean, I had some numbers here, like Britain, for example, they paid 2.6 billion US dollars. I mean, the value today to former slave owners, about 3,000 British slave owners after the slavery was abolished, I mean, officially in 1833, even though it continues now in other forms. So other European countries like France, Denmark, Spain, the Netherlands, they pay compensation to the former slave owners. And they're very reluctant today to address that. I mean, exactly was mentioned that they left from a conflict, but I mean, there are other outrageous cases, like for example, in France, the case with Haiti, right? Remember, Haitian revolution, the first country where slaves managed to fight and obtain their own independence and freedom from slavery, establishing their own independent republic, right? At the end of 18th century. Well, France, after several decades, they imposed them to pay reparations to former slave owners and threatening them with war, with another occupation. So Haiti had to pay until, I forgot, 1940s, 1950s. So for more than 100 years, they had to pay reparations to former slave owners from France under the threat of war. So again, for several generations, Haitian is one of the main reasons why Haiti is struggling so much economic and social difficulties, because this wealth was extracted there. And when more recently, the last 2 decades in Haiti, there were voices that France should do something about it, at least to return the money that they extorted as reparations from former slaves who won the freedom. France is very reluctant. They deny everything. They don't want to pay anything. So, I mean, I know there's a reparation movement in Africa. It started like in the 1990s, like African reparation movements, international reparation movements. We had a huge conference early on in the 1990s in Lagos, Nigeria. Among other things, they requested cancel from this former colonial power that exploited people for hundreds of years and were very much involved in slave trade. So they asked for cancellation of Africa's debt, right? Canceling this debt that is burdening local economies. This was refused in general. Then they mentioned that this reparation basically at the last stage of decolonization process in a way, right? I mean, addressing this issue that maybe it seems to be trivial to some people, but it's a main issue actually. There were calls for a new Marshall Plan, the one adopted by the United States at the end of the Second World War in Europe, to rebuild ravished economies in European Union, especially, in Europe, especially in Western Europe, because Eastern European countries, they refused this plan. So the Marshall Plan for Africa to help rebuilding and developing Africa still is not the answer. So it's a lot of things to be done there in terms of this broader global reparation movement.
So, Cam, to kind of build on that about what is left to be done. So I learned recently that California now may potentially become one of the first states to move forward with reparations. We talked a little bit tonight about House Resolution 40, which on both sides of the aisle doesn't seem to be getting a lot of legs. Where are we now? Do you see California being successful, or what is going to need to be done to, you think, move forward? I know you testified, I watched your testimony to move HR 40 forward.
So so California is the first state to actually pass a legislation that actually has seated a commission, or in their case, a task force, to examine the history of discrimination, atrocities, trauma, et cetera, and to develop proposals. The California legislation was lifted out of HR 40. Its finding and purpose are word for word that of HR 40. So it is a test of the federal legislation to examine the history and develop proposals. It is moving along. There'll be another session tomorrow and Thursday. Definitely people want to, if they have an opportunity, they can listen in to that task force proceeding. And we look at it as a mini HR 40. Federally, we have a lot of movement. I saw in the chat, in the questions, what's the pulse of America right now? In the House, we have a small Democratic controlled House. You need a simple majority to pass legislation in the House. Simple majority is 435 congresspersons. So a simple majority is half, which is 217 plus 1, which is 218. Currently, we have over 197 co-sponsors. We have 20 confirmed yes votes, meaning that if the legislation was to go to the floor, even though I'm not a co-sponsor, I will vote yes. So we have 217 votes. We have, enough to take it to the floor to get that other one vote to pass. And that's, we've lobbied the Asian caucus, we lobbied the Progressive Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, and of course the Black Caucus to get those 217 confirmed yes votes. So if it was to be taken to the House floor right now, today, tomorrow, we believe it would pass. On the Senate side, we have about 20 co-sponsors. We know you need a supermajority on the Senate in order to pass the legislation. So you need 60 votes. We're not going to get 10 Republicans to we don't have one Republican in the House, and certainly we don't think we would get one in the Senate either. And all the Democrats are not strongly behind this legislation in the Senate. There are about 23 Senate committees, and we have the leadership, the leader of the Senate, Schumer, and probably 12 of the 23 committee chairs have signed on. And we have a total of about 20 senators who have signed on, 22 senators who have signed on to the legislations. And that's considerate, looking at where we were just 2 years ago with this legislation. We believe that we have enough Democratic support in Congress to ask the president to pass this legislation via an executive order. And that's really where we're moving. We think we can get it done. Steny Hoyer, the leader of the Democratic caucus, Democratic leader in the House, stated that he would urge the president to move the legislation to via an executive order, because he did not want those moderate Democrats to make this tough vote in the House if it was taken to the floor. James Clyburn, who's a majority whip, whose job is to whip up that last vote, also is fearful of bringing the bill to the floor for the same reason that they may lose the majority in the midterm election. So all things look like HR 40 will be, the pressure would be at the White House to enact this legislation. And so as we continue to push for a House floor vote, we're also moving toward an executive order at this time. So, and we think that with some of the things that Biden has said, and we know that there was an article that came out about a week ago, about 2 weeks ago, saying how Blacks are moving away from the Democratic Party. And so to build and continue and maintain the base of the party with the Black vote, I think they need to do something radical and not just, a Juneteenth holiday, or now there's a bill that's designed to make Lift Every Voice a national hymn. Very symbolic. I don't think that's going to do it. I think they had to do something radical. The party has to do something radical, and certainly passing HR 40 on the floor and even an executive order is something that they can do.
And Kihana, first, I don't know how Kamm is awake right now, because you do so much. You must be exhausted. So it's just so incredible. Kihana, one of the things that we talk a lot about, particularly with the young people that come to the museum, is we call them to be upstanders, right? And how can you, really, agitate for and advocate for change in your communities and what you're passionate about? And what would you say, today we actually had a building full of 13-year-olds that were part of our student leadership day, that were learning how to be leaders in their communities and schools. And what would you say to those young people about how to get involved in this issue, to be part of the conversation, and how to be part of this movement to advocate for change and the reparations?
That's a big question. I know we're really quick. But one of the most, I mean, obviously I'm biased, I'm in education, but I think that one of the biggest things that we have to do is to try to address the miseducation of this entire country. And so I think a part of the problem, like I teach Introduction to African American Studies, and by the end of the course, we get to reparations at the end, and students are like, I get it, right? Because they've gone through the whole process, right? They've studied about the Black experience from the period of enslavement and forward, right? And there's another class that starts before the period of enslavement, right? And so I think that that's one of the main things that we have to do is educate ourselves. And so I would just really encourage folks to read about reparations, but not just to read about reparations, to read about, for example, enslavement, right? Because I think, like I said earlier, that people have this misconception about slavery and really just think about it as like men in particular being whipped or women in particular being raped. That is not all that slavery was, right? And these are actually individual people who had feelings, who had thoughts, who had desires, who had emotions, who had families that were stolen from. I mean, there's all kinds of aspects of that experience that I think if people really took the time to understand what some of those experiences were, that they would have a different sensibility around the idea of reparations. So that's one thing. And then another thing I think is that, once you do that work, is to support reparations initiatives, right? Both locally and nationally, to get involved, to understand what folks are doing, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Folks are already doing this work, right? Kamm has been talking about this all night, right? This work has been done, it's being done right now. History is unfolding before us. And so let's look to these organizations that are doing this work and get involved with those organizations. And like I said, locally and nationally. And so I just think that, those are two. Well, one last thing I'll say too is that, because I think this is important and we often minimize this, is talk to your friends and family, right? I was reading a speech recently by Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, was giving a speech in Berkeley. And one of the things that he was saying to this predominantly white audience at UC Berkeley was like, organize the white community, right? That's something that you can do, right? That's a tangible thing that you can do that would be very helpful for us, because that's necessary in order for things to move on our end. And so I think having those conversations with your family, having those conversations with your friends, talking to folks about ideas that people don't really think much about, or that are just taboo or a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, and not feeling like your individual opinion or your individual dollar or your individual hour doesn't matter. It does matter, right? Those things, the collective hours and dollars and opinions are what matters, and that's what moves the needle. And so I think those are some things that we can do right now to be a part of affecting change.
Thank you. Well, I hope my colleague Jessica is listening, because I want to bring all three of you to talk to our college students that are coming in the fall about this issue. So we are well beyond time, but I just want to thank Stefan and Kihana and Kamm. One of the things that I always just find so incredible is, I know that this work cannot be easy, but the passion that each of you have for the work that you do, the research that you're doing, is just so inspiring. And I want to thank the three of you for joining me and being part of the conversation. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. My colleague Rahim, if he hasn't done so already, is going to drop into the chat a survey about this evening. I invite everybody to join us for our next program on Sunday, March 6th. where we will actually talk with two of the attorneys involved in Sinnis versus Kessler, which is the white supremacy trial for Unite the Right. That was part of the Charlottesville rally, and just the ongoing conversation about issues of white nationalism, white supremacy in the United States. But again, Stefan, Kamm, Kihana, thank you so much for the incredible work that you're doing. I know this will not be the last that we hear from the three of you at all, and anything that the museum can do to be a supporter and resource. But thank you again for joining us, and thank everyone in the audience for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.